I'm Ari Redbord, and this is TRM Talks. I am Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. At TRM, we provide blockchain intelligence software to support law enforcement investigations and to help financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses mitigate financial crime risk within the emerging digital asset economy. Prior to joining TRM, I spent 15 years in the U.S. federal government, first as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and then as a Treasury Department official, where I worked to safeguard the financial system against terrorist financiers, weapons of mass destruction proliferators, drug kingpins, and other rogue actors. On TRM Talks, I sit down with business leaders, policymakers, investigators, and friends from across the crypto ecosystem who are working to build a safer financial system. Today, I sit down with Raj Mukherjee, the Executive Director for Compliance and Implementation at the Office of Digital Assets at the IRS. But first, inside the lab, where I share data-driven insights from our blockchain intelligence team. TRM's blockchain intelligence team recently put out our illicit crypto economy report, looking at trends from 2023. Recently on TRM Talks Inside the Lab, I've been going through each of those categories and breaking them down. Today, we're going to be talking about sanctions. According to TRM, the total value of funds sent to sanctioned addresses and entities fell to $16.2 billion in 2023 from $25.4 billion in 2022. However, and this is a really important point, sanctions designations from OFAC and others, OFAC is the Office of Foreign Asset Control within the U.S. Treasury Department, rose by 3 times, from 11 sanctions designations in 2022 to 33 designations in 2023. Among the targets of OFAC designations last year, we saw 12 ransomware groups, 6 high-risk exchanges, and a cryptocurrency mixing service. We have seen OFAC very, very focused in the cryptocurrency space over the last few years, really targeting what on one TRM Talks a couple of years ago, Todd Conklin, who's a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Treasury, called the illicit underbelly of the crypto ecosystem. So non-compliant exchanges, many of which are Russia-based, like Suex, Chadex, Garantex, Bitslotto, most recently Buycash, a Gaza-based exchange, which was sanctioned in 2024 by OFAC. We've also seen them target darknet markets like Hydra, Alphabay, and others over the years. And again, as mentioned, ransomware groups, which have been attacking different businesses and demanding payment in crypto. A place that there's been a lot of focus in 2023 and now even more so in 2024 is on mixing services. Mixers are sort of on-chain exchanges that mix funds and potentially obfuscate transactions. And there's different categories of mixers. I think people often loop them all together, but we've seen OFAC and the Department of Justice go after what I consider mixing services that are conspiring with cyber criminals like Helix and Bitcoin Fog that actually advertise on darknet markets. Those were sanctioned a bunch of years ago, and we've seen actual criminal prosecutions in both the Helix and Bitcoin Fog case, leading to criminal penalties, jail sentences. But there's this other group of mixers that are used for both lawful and illicit purposes, and those are much more complicated, like Tornado Cash, which we saw sanctioned about 2 years ago. We're now seeing criminal prosecutions in that case. Most recently, Samurai Mixer, we've seen a criminal prosecution there. So OFAC and DOJ have been very, very focused on mixing services because those services are facilitating illicit activity, but it's very, very complicated because they're also facilitating lawful activity in an open financial system. And I think the challenge for regulators, and why I'm sometimes grateful I'm not still one, is how do we use sanctions to go after the illicit actors that are using these services, but at the same time allow lawful users to engage in a private and secure manner, which is kind of more important than ever. So I think it's a huge piece to this puzzle. And finally, look, I don't think 2024 is going to be any different. We may still see those volumes down, but we're going to see more and more sanctions activity and already are. Obviously, huge focus on Iran right now with the situation in Israel and in Gaza. Iran recently fired missiles at Israel, and we saw the U.S. respond with additional sanctions. Again, more mixing activity. We're seeing another sort of interesting trend, and that is OFAC is using sanctions to go after fintechs that are building in the blockchain space. So we saw a designation on a number of fintechs in Russia that are helping sanctioned Russian financial institutions, including the central bank, build blockchain technology, right? The rails that can potentially move funds around the US dollar. And then finally, Iran. We saw an Iranian fintech sanctioned recently by OFAC for providing services to the central bank of Iran to help them develop a CBDC. So maybe another trend that we're looking at in 2024. Mixers, certainly Iran, we're already seeing that. And maybe we'll sort of see that fintech space. Who's helping these sanctioned entities or jurisdictions or actors potentially circumvent sanctions using blockchain technology? So lots of really good data from 2023, already seeing a lot of activity in 2024, and I know we'll continue this conversation. Now, let's sit down with Raj Mukherjee. Raj, thank you so much for joining TRM Talks today.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm excited to be here.
I wanted to do this for some time, even when you were in industry, and now really excited about this new role at IRS, exploring the role of IRS in the digital asset space. So before we dig into taxation in crypto, we'd love to hear about your journey.
It's been a unique one. I've spent almost all of my career till this point in private industry. I started way back for investment banks. I was in a number of investment banks in New York, in-house counsel roles, overseeing various areas of tax. And I was happily doing so. And I remember probably about 6 years ago now, I was speaking at the EEI conference, which is a big one for all tax information reporting folks to join. And this then CFO of Coinbase happened to be there. And she approached me and said, "Hey, would you like to come work for Coinbase to start creating this architecture for information reporting?" Now, what's interesting about that at that point in time was that this was quite a while ago. This was pre-COVID. So it was fascinating that they were already thinking about that. But that's where I made sort of the right turn from TradFi into the world of digital assets and crypto. And I was with Coinbase for a number of years, then went to a different exchange as their head of tax, wanted to then explore more on the blockchain side. So I went to a blockchain Ethereum SaaS company. And while I was there as their head of tax, I got approached by the service to say, "Hey, we're at the precipice of a lot of very important things that are going on. One of the things we want to bring in is more industry experience. We have great assets within the service and also at Treasury." But they felt what was missing was that industry perspective. And my interest in joining federal government at this point in my career was also because I felt when I was in industry, one of the challenges were that the government and the industry were, with the best of intentions, speaking past each other. I think that there was a gap in managing the conversation. And I felt like if there was any value add I could add to this position and this office at this point in time, that would be one of the big ones. Also, for me, I had always been curious about how the federal government works. Why does it take as long as it takes to release regulations? And I felt like this would be a great opportunity for that learning curve, and I've learned quite a bit.
It's interesting, there are a lot of folks like myself who spent a lot of time in the federal government and then went into private industry, but you don't see it on the flip side as much. And actually, in order to have those conversations, you need it to happen both ways. And I think you're a rare example, actually, of where it's worked. I'm actually going to back you up a little bit. Did you have some sort of moment where like, hey, this is the space that I'm passionate about, that I want to develop my subject matter expertise around, when you decided this is what I want to focus my time on?
That's an interesting question because when I went to law school, I actually wanted to work for a completely different area of law. I actually wanted to work for international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, or even sort of the International Criminal Court. But when I was towards the end of law school, I had an opportunity to work for KPMG. And that was my introduction into the area of international tax in that particular case. And also I did a lot of work in sort of expatriate tax. The watershed moment really was that I wanted a career that allowed me to solve complex issues. And the other part I wanted is to be involved in rulemaking and interpretation of those rules, right? I mean, that's where my interest area lay. And then it was only probably about 3 or 4 years into my career when I felt that while I had enjoyed that, I wanted to do something a little bit more directly related to rulemaking. My journey has been quite interesting because generally, people don't start at a niche and then go general and then go back to the niche. So it's been an exciting but meandering journey.
No, I love it. And honestly, like that's why I was so eager to have you on, because it is such a unique trajectory, such a unique journey, and to end up in the US federal government. It's interesting. I had Max Burnt, who's at TaxFit, on recently, and I asked him a similar question around tax. And he basically said, look, tax is one of the most important sort of social constructs that we have in the world today, right? Like when I think about tax, I'm like death and taxes, right? Things you just don't want to deal with or have happen. But it really is a social tool, and how we deploy them and how we deploy tax policy is absolutely critical. Everything we have, there's social constructs in place that pays for it. And I feel like your answer got to that, right? I love it. So to that end, let's dig in a little bit to your role at IRS, because that's essentially what you're doing, right? It's sort of like building that confine around digital assets in particular.
Yeah, so the Office of Digital Asset Initiative was set up about a year and a half ago with the aim to centralize the array of touch points for digital assets across the service. So it's digital assets is one of those areas where if you look at the various areas of the IRS, whether it's large business and international or small business or wage or any of these areas, it touches some taxpayer and more so. And what we have in the structure of the office is representation from both the civil and the criminal side of IRS. So we have details from CI, from SBSC, from LBNI, and the idea is action, regulations, implementation plans, technology inputs, all of this stuff through the central office. Now, that is not to say that we have imported everything into the office, but rather it's sort of a federated model where we have a seat and then we work directly with IRS counsel, Treasury counsel when it comes to, say, regulations and language of the regs. We work with the various IT teams as to who's going to ingest all the information from the 1099 DAs, for example. So we have all these different areas, and then we refer with CI on cases that they're working on. Is there a civil angle to those cases when it comes to things like John Doe summons and whistleblowers and things like that? And the idea is not to miss the incidental accidents of digital asset actions that may otherwise be solely within the silo of one bod. The other thing also is that we have and are developing a brand new compliance structure. As you may know, the IRS made public probably about a month ago that we have a brand new organization under the Deputy Commissioner called the CTCO, which is the Chief Tax Compliance Office. And there's a new Chief Tax Compliance Officer, Heather Malloy, who's been at the service for quite some time. And the Digital Asset Office actually reports to her. So I'm one of her direct reports. And the idea is, again, how to break down those silos. And because the other bods now all report up to her in the compliance organization, how do we create an enterprise-wide compliance structure where digital asset is part of it because it touches all those areas? So that has been a big part of my first weeks at the IRS. The second part I would say equally important is I've been heavily involved with both Treasury and IRS counsel on working on the comments and working on the regs from the proposed to the final draft. We're still in the middle of all of that, but as Treasury has made public, we intend to publish the final regs sometime this year. So it's a very tight deadline. As you know, it has to go through the pink circulation, the green circulation, everything I'm learning about. But we're deep in the heart of all of that. So that has been a big part of my job. The third thing I would say is I inherited an incredibly talented team. But I think that in what I call the phase two of this office, it needed more structure and direction. And so under Heather's direction and her vision of what this compliance office should be, and the digital asset office as part of that, I've been heavily involved in strategizing with her and her team on where does the Office of Digital Asset fit? Is it just digital asset or is it emerging issues, for example? Is it a 5-year or a 10-year office? How do we outline that and come back with a comprehensive compliance plan that is both educational as well as has an enforcement arm when required?
That was an amazing answer. You talked about reading the responses and working on the regs. What is the rule you're referring to? And then what does the work look like?
Sure. The NPRM for 6045 are the broker regulations, right? This is where the IRS released and Treasury released the draft regulations. I believe it was August of 2023. That was for the first time a comprehensive set of rules on digital assets. Who's a broker? What's within the scope? What is considered a digital asset? How is it going to be taxed? Covered centralized exchanges or CFI and the DeFi world, right? It was about 288 pages of it. We got about close to 45,000 comments in the comment period. A lot of them were AI generated. But how we looked into it actually is quite interesting. Someone asked me, did you just discard the ones that you felt were AI generated? We actually didn't do that. We approached the subject differently. We categorized every comment based on the substantive theme. And then we went through, AI or not, every comment. And then what we do is we go through every comment, we balance that against what the proposed regs are, we examine the intent of those comments, and we balance that with AP consideration. Does it conflict something else? Does it relate to another reg that maybe has been dealt with in a different project? And all of this together then helps us to come with finalized regs. And the top priorities are not only setting out the rules, but setting out the rules in a way that it would last, and also setting out the rules in a way that it would stand and would be easy for taxpayers and entities to implement. So there's a number of considerations that go into how those proposed regs become final regs. And this has been also a learning curve for me, because having come from private sector, I, along with many others, always felt, well, why is it taking so long? And now I actually know why, because if you don't do a thorough job, and if you don't consider all of the factors that are relevant, you could easily get a portion of the regs challenged and the entire reg struck down. And that is not beneficial either for the taxpayer, for the industry, or for the service.
And then one thing I thought was really cool and is that you have all these components within IRS and the larger Treasury department that are working together. SBFC, which is small business self-employed. You mentioned IRSCI, which is the criminal investigations, which folks like us at TRM work really closely with on investigating money laundering, tax evasion, et cetera. I have to give shout outs to Trish Turner, who's been doing this work at IRS for a really long time, Jared Koopman, who I know is leading a lot of this work at IRSCI. But basically, what you guys have done is like harness the power of the Treasury Department plus these different components to build out this digital asset initiative. Going back to your background a little bit, it's crazy to have dealt with this at a private one company level and now being at look at how does this impact 300 million taxpayers? How has that changed your thinking on the involvement of government or taxation or sort of the broader picture?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Look, tax, as we've discussed, is complicated already. Even when I worked in TradFi, depending on income sourcing or the residency of the taxpayer or the headquarters of the HQ, these are like complex issues. I think now put it in context of a brand new asset class, and I mean comparatively, right? Crypto's been around for what, about 10 or 15 years now, but compared to securities, right? It's still in its infancy. You put that in context of the asset type and a rapidly evolving industry. It is one of the fastest ideation to market industry that I think we have seen in quite some time, if not ever. But I think it makes it harder for government to come up with regulations that keeps up with the progress. I think it is fair to say that to some extent, we will still always be catching up a little bit, just because by the time you iterate a law, there's 20 iterations of that product type, right? I think we've accepted that within the context of it. But I think what is important here is first to keep the taxpayer in mind. We know that the majority of taxpayers that are involved in crypto transactions in the United States came through the centralized exchanges. These are people that want to dabble in Bitcoin, dabble in Ethereum. They want to try what is Doge and all of that. And they're curious about this new asset class. And they see it as a new way of investment or just satisfying their curiosity. And I think what we have said in the IRS is, how do we address the confusion for those taxpayers when it comes to filing tax returns? And that is the primary first goal, because so far there's been a lot of confusion. So we understood that there was a lot of angst in the industry. And obviously with the John Doe summons that have gone out for a couple of exchanges, there is some anxiousness in the industry about, the direction and is it the whip before the cart, as they say. But this has been a cornerstone of our considerations of what is most important. And we also feel that once the regs are released and once the 1099 DA becomes implementation friendly, then you actually will automatically see an enhancement in voluntary compliance.
That's really useful. You have mentioned so many sort of different pieces of what IRS does in this space. So I'm just going to break them down and like also just see what am I missing. So you have obviously what everyone I think thinks of, and that is the 1099 piece, right? Like what are you required to declare within your taxes around sort of crypto gains, losses, et cetera. We're talking about the broker regs that you're working on right now and the timeline around that. We've talked about 1040, John Doe subpoenas. Obviously, those all fit within this umbrella. A, what am I missing? And then B, like, are there any of those specifically that you want to dig into?
So I think you're not missing anything. I think right now the way it works, and I think of it as sort of pre-reg and post-reg compliance, right? There's the release of the final regs at some time this year, but that's also going to have a calendar of when it's actually implemented. Currently, what the taxpayers are required to do is check the box on the 1040 to indicate whether they have any crypto transactions. And if they have gains and losses, they need to indicate that as part of their income. They don't really need to do anything beyond that. And then what we expect is once the final regs are released and the broker regulations are clear, then we will have 1099-DA as the primary form through which customers and entities will report their crypto transactions. We do acknowledge that there are challenges of situations where there are multiple brokers, right? Especially in the DeFi world. There are situations of privacy concerns. There are concerns about timeline for implementation. And then finally, there are concerns about backup withholding. And these are all things that we're discussing right now at the IRS and Treasury level, because the way currently it's set up, everything is in fiat. And we know that for this industry, 24% of what is the big question, because the asset is so volatile and goes up and down. So these are things that we are definitely considering, but those will form the primary compliance and in tax information reporting vehicles. If you look back on tax information and reporting, I look at it as three pillars. The first one is due diligence, where you collect the W-8, W-9 information, right? Then you have the transaction monitoring and reporting, part of which is the withholding and the remittance of that withholding to the IRS. And then you have the year-end reporting. So you'll see those aspects embedded within the final regulations. And most of it, will look more or less the same in principle, but obviously we recognize that there may be some relief. There are areas that, there may be some flexibility because we do acknowledge that this industry is a little different.
When I first met you and realized that sort of you had this new role, I think I really appreciated having an industry view on specific regulation in there. What I didn't appreciate much, which may be more important, is the timeline piece, how long it does potentially take to implement these types of procedures. One thing when we talk to IRS folks is voluntary disclosure. It seems to be sort of something that just is a buzzword or comes up all the time.
Yeah, I mean, the IRS always welcomes voluntary disclosures. I think that we acknowledge again that there has been a lot of uncertainty in this area, in spite of the notices that were released and the FAQs and whatnot. I mean, there is a lot of questions out there, and we acknowledge that people may have thought they were doing the right thing and inadvertently may have not done the right thing. And we always encourage people to come up and do a voluntary disclosure. I cannot comment on whether we will initiate or announce a formal voluntary disclosure program pre-implementation of the reg, but we are always open to that idea.
Fantastic. This would not be TRM Talks if I did not ask something on illicit finance. And one thing I think is really interesting about your role is this sort of working closely with IRS-CI, which is just an extraordinary team. I mean, this little tiny agency has seized $11 billion in crypto over the last couple of years. I mean, this is the GDP of many small countries out there, right? So you have really the foremost law enforcement entity in the world at crypto investigations sitting side by side you on this stuff. How do you interact with them? And also, how do you see sort of illicit finance more broadly in the role of IRS?
I think it's important to note that, while Treasury or FinCEN oversees regulations, right, the IRS is the compliance and enforcement arm, both on the CI and the civil side. Obviously, Treasury will set all the policies and IRS will then execute on that policy to make sure that, the relevant information and cases are being examined. CI looks at the criminal side, then we have the BSA that looks at the civil side. I think the primary importance both for the civil and the CI side is the guidance and the sandbox that regulations put into place, because those are the guiding principles. And then this is what is used by CI to keep potential bad actors out of this financial transaction space and to protect users and support sound business practice. Sound financial activity, obviously, the great importance of the United States as a country and as a market. I believe President Biden highlighted this importance in his EO related to digital assets, where he called it a national interest to mitigate risks through regulation and oversight and law enforcement action.
Really appreciate those thoughts around this. And I would encourage listeners to listen to the TRM Talks we did pretty recently with Jared Koopman, who's an IRS CI. Final question. I've been staring at you during this conversation and our viewers can't see, but behind you is this really extraordinary piece of art Would you talk a little bit about it? It's kind of been blowing me away the whole time.
So one of my favorite pastimes is traveling. So amongst my travels to Southeast Asia, I went to Thailand years ago. Fascinating culture, fascinating food, wonderful people. But as part of that, in Thailand, there's a large temple. So this photograph behind me is from the Temple of the Leaning Buddha, which I understand is either the second or the third largest Leaning Buddha statue in the world. It's made entirely of metal and mother of pearl designs. So that's what this is of. It is in Bangkok. It's very close to the royal compound. And if anyone travels to Thailand, I highly recommend. First of all, I highly recommend traveling to Thailand. But secondly, I highly recommend going and seeing this because while this particular statue is fascinating in itself, the entire temple complex is something to behold.
And you took this photo.
I did take this photo. As a matter of fact, every piece of art in my little condo is actually photographs I've taken in my travels around the world. I stopped taking camera with me for a long time ago, and I actually use the digital phones these days are so good. So most of these photos are all taken with one of those devices.
Oh, I love that. It's like the ultimate. This has been taken with an iPhone. Raj, thank you so much for joining TRM Talks. This was an awesome, super informative discussion.
Thank you for this opportunity.
There are really so many takeaways from that conversation. I think sort of the highest level is the big role that tax authorities play within the crypto ecosystem today, right? We talked about a lot about sort of what's happening recently, but this is going back, several years where exchanges are receiving John Doe subpoenas, investors are declaring crypto gains and losses. So IRS is really leading the way in many respects. Really, really appreciated the fact that Raj delved into how they're looking at the feedback they got on the broker rule as they're shaping regulation. Really interesting to see sort of the different buckets, the way that they put together a team really across IRS and Treasury today, small business, self-employed, working with IRS criminal investigations, working with sort of the broader policy teams, working with counsel. Honestly, like this was one of those TRM talks where I learned a lot about the way IRS thinks about crypto and frankly about Raj personally. I think that his journey backwards, for lack of a better description, right? Like spending a career in industry and then going to the government as opposed to so many of us who did the opposite is really critical. And I think he made the point that it's important to have former government folks in industry, but it's also important to have former industry folks in the government. He really personifies that. Next on TRM Talks, I sit down with the Wyoming Stable Token Commission Executive Director, Anthony Apollo. The state of Wyoming is known as the Wild West, a land of wide open spaces, the nation's most iconic national parks, and rodeo bronc and bucks. But Wyoming over the last few years has become known for something else, cryptocurrency. So how has Wyoming become the new frontier for financial innovation? It could be a forward-leaning approach to chartering crypto banks, favorable legislation that provides legal clarity around cryptocurrency, or the safe and sound banking environment for crypto businesses. We're going to talk to Anthony about Wyoming's place in the crypto ecosystem and much more. If you love the show, leave a review wherever you're listening to it. Follow us on LinkedIn to subscribe to our newsletter, The Weekly Roundup, to get the latest news on crypto regulation, compliance, and investigations.
TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. This episode was produced in partnership with Voltage Productions. The music for this show was provided by Ecolix.
Now, let's get back to building.